Welcome. Thank you for joining us. My name is Andrea Perry. I am the Associate Director for Pilot Projects at Harvard Radcliffe Institute. While I'm not able to join you live, it is my honor to welcome you to our program titled, Who is Policing the Police? This program is presented as part of the Presidential Initiative on Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery, a university-wide effort anchored at Harvard Radcliffe Institute. We are excited to be co-sponsoring it with the Generational African American Student Association at Harvard, who work to foster community on the university's campuses and raise awareness and spark social change on issues pertaining to the heinous legacy of slavery in the United States. Radcliffe is grateful to be in a position to gather practitioners and experts from academia to bring together cutting-edge research with real-world challenges and solutions. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge members of the Radcliffe Institute Leadership Society and our annual donors who are watching this afternoon. Your generosity keeps Radcliffe programming free and open to the public, and we thank you. As a society, we appear now to be at an inflection point around redefining public safety in the criminal legal system. No more is this evident than in conversations that discuss the role of law enforcement in our society. Today, we are joined by leading thinkers and doers who represent a range of activities as we specifically consider what does police accountability really mean, who should be overseeing it, and how it impacts our thoughts around public safety for our most vulnerable and marginalized populations. We are fortunate to have three speakers and a moderator with us on the panel who are influential leaders and experts in their fields. All have meaningful connections and deep experiences in today's topic and will share their unique perspectives on police accountability. Our speakers are Rosa Brooks, Scott K. Ginsburg Professor in Law and Policy at Georgetown University Law Center. She will be serving as our moderator for today's session. Victor Clay, Chief at the Harvard University Police Department. Jeffrey Lopes, Boston Police Detective and President of the Massachusetts Association of Minority Law Enforcement Officers. Hilary Rau, Vice President of Policy and Community Engagement at the Center for Policing Equity. We'll hear first from Rosa Brooks, who will then turn it over to the panel of speakers. We will conclude with audience Q&A. We encourage those of you watching to use the Q&A feature on Zoom to submit your questions at any time during the program, and their speakers will try to address as many as possible. Since we anticipate a lot of questions, we ask that you keep them short, so this will increase the number of questions we can answer. It is my distinct honor to pass the virtual floor now to Rosa Brooks.
Thank you so much, Andrea. And I want to thank the Harvard Radcliffe Institute for putting this on and the Harvard Generational African American Students Association for co-sponsoring it. It's great to be here. I thought I would just start out by saying what a 2 years it has been when it comes to thinking about policing issues. I'm sort of tempted to quote Charles Dickens, The Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Thinking back just on the last couple of years, we started with the pandemic, just over 2 years ago. That had a profound impact on policing when physical contact with people, when arrests, when police stops, when putting someone in jail poses a real safety risk, both to police and to everybody else they come into contact with. That led a lot of police departments around the country to do something that in many cases, activists and reformers have been urging for a long time, which is reconsider whether custodial arrests are as important, especially for more minor offenses, as they have traditionally been seen as, and led a lot of police departments to think hard about things like, well, does every call require a police presence? Does every 911 call require armed officers to show up physically? Or is there a better way to do this? Is it sort of a grand scale national experiment on thinking about various kinds of changes to policing? A couple months after that, we had the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, which sparked a nationwide, indeed, many ways global, racial justice movement that also was deeply and inherently interconnected with a movement to rethink policing in pretty radical ways. We saw massive protests and demonstrations all around the country. We saw a real surge of interest in city leadership around the country, in state legislatures and in Congress, in thinking about how do we change policing, what will fix it, as well as the beginnings of an interesting and important conversation about whether we should try to fix policing or whether we should instead be thinking about a completely different approach to creating public safety. That wasn't all. After that, this is all the last couple of years, we got the January 6th failed insurrection in Washington, D.C., just outside my office windows, the US Capitol, and we saw a very different view of policing. On the one hand, we saw some more bad aspects of policing. We saw police initially appear to treat with kid gloves a largely white group that turned into an insurrectionist mob, and was a very stark contrast from the much more heavy-handed approach to racial justice protesters in Washington, D.C. just 6 months or so earlier. But on the other hand, we also saw on January 6th, police officers incredibly courageously, literally putting their lives on the line to protect both the ultimate symbol of our democracy and actual human beings in the Capitol, elected representatives, staff, et cetera, from a mob that was trying to essentially undermine the rule of law in the deepest possible ways. Not least, in the last couple of years, we've also seen a dramatic rise in homicide and gun violence rates in most American cities, which has further complicated the discussion of the police. And one of the things that's always struck me about conversations about policing in the United States is that we tend towards a kind of rhetorical whiplash in this country. It's very hard for people not to fall into saying either police are selfless, underappreciated heroes, or they're brutal racist thugs. Either we need to have more money in police budgets, we need more police on the streets, or we need to abolish the police, or at least take away much of their money and give it to somebody else. As a nation, I think we're not all that great at thinking about things in more nuanced ways, but I know that the people who are on this panel today are going to help us do exactly that. And it's something I think is incredibly important to try to get beyond those binary opposites, to think back on the events of the last 2 years and the ways in which, for all the sort of chaos and pain, it's also created a real opportunity, and I think a really unique moment during which we can collectively come together to start having much more interesting and serious conversations about policing, about public safety, about what it means to fix that. So I'm going to wrap up my introduction, and I won't introduce my co-panelists because Andrea already gave you their brief bios. Their full bios are on the website for this event. You can look at them in more detail, but let me start just by turning to you, Jeff, with the first question. I feel like most of us think we know what bad policing looks like, or at least we can sure think of a lot of examples of bad policing. And, you know, as I mentioned, George Floyd's killing sure comes to mind. And we can all think of, you know, police killings, police egregious misconduct, and so on. So we all think we know what bad policing looks like. Do we know what good policing looks like? You know, what do you think there is any consensus about what is good policing, and do we know it when we see it? Can we measure it? What does it look like?
Yeah, Rosa, thank you for that question. I think we do know what good policing is. We know that good policing is policing with empathy. It's understanding that the community voice belongs in policing. And that's why I'm proud to be president of the Massachusetts Association of Minority Law Enforcement Officers, because for over 5 decades, we've tried to bring that additional perspective to the forefront. We've tried to bring that added perspective into public policy around policing. We've tried to change policies to make sure that the community's voice is really reflected in public policy around police accountability. And we really tried to redefine what accountability looks like for policing. So we know that policing is really about empathy. It's about accountability. It's about engagement, understanding the communities that we're from, but also policing as if we understand those communities, making sure that our officers understand those communities, and that when they're embedded in those communities, that they're learning from those communities. And so we know that policing works when policing matters, when we take policing seriously by making sure that everyone has a seat at the table. And that's why for over 5 decades, we've been fighting to make sure that that minority officer perspective is brought to the table, because as a minority officer, I have a lived experience as a person of color, but I also have an experience as a police officer that allows me to guide how policy should be and how policy could be changed for the betterment of society.
Thanks, Jeff. Let me, Vic, throw a question in your direction. You've been in policing for many, many years. If we think we know what good policing is, and you're welcome to take a stab at that one too, if you want. Why is it so hard to get it? Why is it that for so long, activists and policy experts and police officers very often themselves have been saying there are some things that are broken about this, and yet it is so incredibly hard to change in this country? Why is it so hard?
I don't know why it's so hard, to be honest with you. I know that we're all human beings, so we are fallible, right? I know that it's difficult to be in a position and given the responsibility of being a cop and separate your humanity and your emotion while you're working. So I think it's just difficult for us to find a consistent model of policing when you have human beings doing this job, because you don't know what the person you're interacting with, what their lived experience is. You don't understand what their day has been like. And likewise, I don't know what the cops that are out there on the streets, what experiences they had before they came to work or what their lived experience is. So it's just a difficult terrain to navigate, to say, here is a consistent model, here is something that we should expect from every single cop.
Thanks, Vic. Hilary, let me come to you. We're going to come back to all of these answers are now opening up lots more questions, and I'm going to be coming back to all of you on each of these. I guess number one, Hilary, do you want to take a stab at that initial question of do we know what good policing is? But then going beyond that, are we having the wrong conversation when we talk about policing the police or police reform? Should we instead be having a very different conversation about public safety that doesn't involve police at the center?
Thank you for that question. And I would say that police reform is one piece of a broader conversation. And at all points of this conversation, affected communities have to be the ones telling us what good policing looks like or what good public safety looks like. At every stage of this process, the people who are affected by existing systems need to be at the heart of driving solutions. And that may not look the same from place to place. My organization works with both community groups and with law enforcement agencies and local government agencies across the country, looking to rethink what public safety could look like. And that includes both how can we reduce harm and discrimination in the systems that we have, and how can we create the systems that we need and that communities need and want and desire. Both of those are crucial pieces to the puzzle. Community engagement and community power are central to both of those things. And data is really crucial to both of those things. Whenever you are trying to implement a change that we hope will reduce disparity, decrease harm, increase help rather than punishment to people who need it, it's crucial that we have good data on what contacts police are having with the public, on what calls are coming in for help that the community is asking for, and that those data are being analyzed and that those data are then being shared transparently with the public so that they can make informed decisions about what public safety should look like for them.
Andrea, thanks. And Jeff, if I can come back to you and raise an issue that you briefly commented on initially. You're the president of the Massachusetts Association of Minority Law Enforcement Officers. You spend a lot of time thinking about the issue of race in policing. I think one very common critique of policing in America that we hear is that it's structurally racist, that there's such a toxic legacy of racism in this country. Policing both reflects that and magnifies that in various ways because police have so much power, and that it's not possible to sort of disentangle that even if we think the problem is not individual police officers who are racist, and I'm sure there are some of them, but even if we put that aside, that sort of structurally speaking, in a racist society, there's no way for police not to be making that worse. What's your reaction to that? I mean, do you think that critique is accurate, or do you think it misses other pieces to this puzzle?
Yeah, so I think that historically there's been structural racism within policing. None of us can sit here and say that that doesn't exist. And so I think what we have to do is really start having these conversations from within and making sure that we can address the structural racism from within our respective law enforcement agencies to make sure that all law enforcement voices are brought to the table to add to that perspective around public policy. I think it's really having conversations with community and those closest to justice, those who have experienced encounters with law enforcement, those who have been experienced incarceration, and really figuring out how we can do better as a system. I think when we talk about structural racism, it's really breaking down what that racism looks like and really figuring out how we can start to begin to change that structural racism. And I think for me, that conversation has been from within, figuring out how we can change that racism from a perspective as a police officer. We all know that there's significant disparity between the way law enforcement officers of color are treated versus their white peers from the system within law enforcement. Our bureaucracies within law enforcement allow for significant structural racism from within. I think in order for us to really work towards change, we have to address that from within and start to call that out. And so I think what we're doing is really making sure that we're bringing that perspective to the table and saying, hey, here's what we see wrong internally, and here's what we see wrong in the community. Here's how we see officers failing our communities. Again, it's that community engagement. But I think when we talk about structural racism, it's really breaking down structural racism in a manner where we can have fruitful conversations around how to make these changes, just like every other system within our society.
Vic, you've been a police officer for a long time, and you've been both a police officer at Harvard, at Caltech, at Occidental, but also spent 30 years in the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. When you think about your career, are there things about policing that you think ordinary people don't understand? I mean, are there if you were trying to explain why policing is so complicated, why change has been so difficult, what do you tell people?
Yeah, that's wow. It is, like Jeff said, it is a system. And in order for us to change that system, I tend not to want to break something apart and start all over again.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes I wake up in the morning and think about the totality of my career, and I say, we need to break this all apart and start all over again. We really do. It goes way beyond the cops that are on the streets now. It started years before I even started this job. But some of the traditions and some of the practices that occurred back in the 80s, 70s, and 80s still exist today. And so I don't understand why we as an industry, we haven't turned a corner and sort of moved the needle into the 21st century. We really haven't. Our recruiting practices are outdated and ineffective. A lot of our training is ineffective. Not in the sense that we're not attuned to the latest or best practices. The fact that the messenger of the training that we receive typically doesn't come from a place that I would really want my family members. Let me put it a different way. The way some cops right now are being trained reminds me of the way I was being trained in the 80s. Society and what I expect for my kids and my friends' kids has changed, where I don't want cops trained like me dealing with my kids or my friends' kids. And that's going to ruffle some people's feathers. They're going to think, who is this guy? Why is he so anti-cop? But they know I'm telling the truth. And what Jeff said, we change from the inside, we acknowledge it, and we move it forward. We stop babying ourselves and acting like we can't be criticized, even from, not only from outside, but within our own departments. We have to start that change process. I don't know why it's so difficult. It starts at the top. It starts with me here at Harvard. It starts with the people that I report to. It starts with the community that I serve. And this is across the country. It should be like that. We need to meet the changes. We need to meet the requirements of the communities we serve. And we should be proud to do that, not resist it.
Hilary, thinking about what Vic and Jeff have just said, one of the things that always strikes me as someone who has also written about and studied the military, is how different policing in America is from the military in certain respects, and how similar in other respects. I mean, I was listening to what you just said, Vic. One of the things that continues to astonish me is the degree to which police training in the US in so many ways is still loosely modeled on a kind of 1980s parody of military boot camp. And we're at a moment when we have police chiefs all over the country saying we need people with good judgment, we need independent thinkers, we need people with empathy, and yet the nature of the training often directly contradicts that message and very much focuses on do what I say, yes sir, don't ask questions. But one of the things that's fascinating about the differences between the police and the military we have one military, and the one military responds to one Secretary of Defense. And so when an administration decides to make a change, for instance, the ending of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, the president says we're going to do this, Secretary of Defense says we're going to do this, and within 3 months, every soldier, sailor, airman, and Marine in the United States military has had training sessions on we're ending this policy, it's changing, because it's a very hierarchical organization and it has an elaborate mechanisms for disseminating new information and changed policies. Policing is completely different though, Hilary, right? I mean, how do you go about making change in a system where we have 18,000 different law enforcement agencies in this country, from the FBI to campus police to city police to rural sheriff's department to the police at the National Zoo?
Absolutely. We have, as you mentioned, roughly 18,000 different law enforcement agencies that work in wildly different jurisdictions in terms of size, in terms of whether they're working with a city versus a zoo versus, a transit agency. So I think that there's a couple pieces here. First, public safety may not look the same in every place. There are hyper-local issues with policing that to a certain degree are valid, but we also want all officers, all public safety officials to meet certain basic standards and to be held to certain common standards of account. I think the federal government has some role to play in this. There's been legislation that's been proposed and has failed that would have the Justice and Policing Act that was proposed and failed to get enough votes in Congress that would have, for example, abolished qualified immunity and tied grant funding to banning of chokeholds. But I think that we still have so much room at the state level to increase and bolster regulation of policing to get some of those basic standards in place. Every state has or has authorized the creation of a Peace Officer Standards and Training Commission at this point, which are the state level bodies that regulate police departments, much like a board of medicine for doctors. And post commissions compared to a state bar or a board of medicine or bodies that regulate barbers or therapists or any other profession have typically far less power, far less ability to discipline people, and standards are lower. And in addition, these bodies typically in most states are dominated by law enforcement. There is a recent tide change with that. Massachusetts became the first state to authorize creation of a post commission with a civilian majority. That's never been done before. So one component of creating change does involve looking at state level regulation of policing, which isn't across the nation, but is still going to create some uniformity across a significant number of officers. And crucial to getting that done well is ensuring that these commissions are not only asked to create effective professional law enforcement agencies, but are asked to create ethical, constitutional, community responsive agencies that protect the civil rights of the people who police officers serve. And that these are agencies that have significant representation from people who are most vulnerable to abuse by police. So people who have been justice involved, people who have experience with lived experience with serious mental health disorders, people who work for civil rights organizations. All of these people need to have a seat at the table at places that are making key decisions about what training officers receive, what minimum standards are in place, et cetera.
I'm going to start turning in a few minutes to some of the questions we've been getting from people in the audience. We've gotten some so far, but I just wanted to encourage everybody who's watching this, if you have questions, please do submit them. And we're going to get to as many of them as we can, starting in just a few minutes. So please post them, and we'd love to see them. Until then, Jeff, let me ask you a question, I guess, that comes out of that. Whose job is it to fix policing? And I to give another military analogy, I think about the Vietnam War era, and there was a lot of anger directed at troops. And then I think American sentiment shifted to say, well, wait a minute, it wasn't the fault of that, 19-year-old Marine conscript that various horrible things have happened and that policy mistakes were made. We need to focus instead on the national level of decision making. And I wonder with policing too, a lot of the racial justice and police reform activist protests have really focused on police. Police must change. Is that fair? Is that right? Do police need to be the ones to fix policing, or is what's wrong with policing something that, police can do some things, in terms of training, recruitment, and so on? Or is this really something where if we want to understand what's wrong, why it's wrong, and how to fix it, we need to understand that there's a lot of things that police can't do themselves, that if we're mad at, if we think that American policing contributes to over-incarceration, for instance, mass incarceration, that police arrest people for relatively minor things, it's not the police officers who make those laws, right? It's legislators and us idiots who vote for them, right? Who come up with this. So how do we think about that? Sort of whose job is it to fix this? And is it possible to kind of draw distinctions between things that can be fixed by police and things that have to be fixed by somebody else, whether it's judges or legislators or whoever, us voters?
I think it's a great question. I think that everyone has a responsibility when it comes to changing the police. And when I say everyone, I say those that are within law enforcement, those are members of the community, those who represent different nonprofits or agencies that are working with those who have had contact with the criminal justice system, with those who suffer from mental illness. I think everyone has a seat at the table to really bring their perspective so that public policy is as advised as it can be. I think what we've seen recently is a bunch of different bureaucratic systems that come into place to police the police, both state level, municipal level, departmental level agencies that now are policing the police or trying to hold police accountable. But what we've seen is all of these different agencies kind of clashing and everyone trying to figure out who has the true authority to change police, who has the true authority to investigate police. And we really haven't ironed out who does have that true authority. Why do we have 5 or 6 different agencies that are now in charge of policing the police? But when we look at individual police departments, right, we really need to hold them accountable. And I think those that we elect into office, both municipal and state and federal, should be holding police departments accountable when it comes to policing our communities, when it comes to changing policies, when it comes to reform. Someone has to make sure that that reform is meaningful and that reform means something, not just blanket policies that say we're committed to reform, we're committed to community policing, we're committed to community engagement, but then the practices that we see in these departments seem counter to that. And so what we have to do as a collective, both internally, externally, community members, community stakeholders, those who invest in our communities, those who own businesses in our communities, should have a seat at the table. Those who are studying our communities, like professors and lawmakers and think tanks, should really be coming up with policies that can help change police departments. And so I don't think there's one person that changes police or holds police accountable. I think it's a host of people. It's a multidisciplinary approach to how policing can be done more effectively.
So here's a question that is coming from the Q&A, and I'll invite any of you to respond to this, and you should all just feel free. If there's a question I ask or something you want to say at this point, just jump right in. And if I see that you're waving your hand or looking like you want to jump in, I'll say please speak, but don't hesitate to just interrupt. Who's getting it right? Is there anyone who's getting policing right? Are there examples of cities or states, initiatives where you feel like that's a model, that's an example of how to get it right in terms of engaging community members, in terms of rethinking police training, police recruitment? Actually, I want to talk about those in a little bit as well. But are there really good examples that people can look to, that you can each think of, where we do have some evidence that in a sea of failed reform efforts, here are some things that have worked? And Hilary, why don't I just start with you on that, but then everybody please jump in.
I think that there's no one place I would hold up and say, this is the place that has fixed racism in policing, this is the place that has it all figured out, but there's numerous places that are showing promising interventions that I think other places can look to. I often talk about our policy work at the Center for Policing Equity in terms of 3 R's: reporting, regulation, and redesign. And I think that there's places showing promise in each of those. So reporting for me is collecting good data about what police are doing and analyzing it regularly. I would hold up California as an example of that. They passed the Racial and Identity Profiling Act, and they have become a real national model for collection of comprehensive data on police stops. And as an organization that works with police data every day, we know that we can do things with California's data that we can't other places. In terms of regulation of policing, we're seeing places like Philadelphia and the state of Virginia enact restrictions on police officers initiating stops based on low-level traffic offenses, which I think is a really promising and exciting intervention to reduce pretextual traffic stops that we know disproportionately target Black drivers. And in terms of redesign, which is creating the systems that we need, there's so many places doing interesting things with this. One of many things I will highlight is that we've had a real increase recently in local communities developing community-based emergency mental health response systems that don't involve police for a certain low-level calls. So Cahoots in Eugene, Oregon has been doing this forever. And now we have STAR in Denver. We have Be Heard in New York. We have numerous systems that are showing that it is possible for low-level mental health calls to respond with a mental health, public health approach rather than with someone with a badge and a gun. So all of these are examples that I would highlight. And there are many more at the local level where people are getting together and saying, we think we can do better than what we currently have.
I guess I can jump in here. And I think what we've seen here locally is really our elected officials bringing to forefront community voice in policing. We had the police reform task force under the previous mayoral administration. We have a current mayoral administration that's bringing police voice into the police commissioner search committee, which is important. We have some regulatory, agencies such as the police officers, the Office of Police Standards and Accountability, that's really going to be pushing the timeline for investigating police officers for misconduct. We have body-worn cameras, right? Body-worn cameras tell a story. They tell a narrative around what's happened in policing. It also can be a benefit to police officers when they're falsely accused, but that brings in a perspective on what exactly happened and how we can change that. It advises training. We also have discipline matrices that have recently come to the forefront, really using standards of practice when it comes to disciplining police officers and making sure that police departments are using standards that are meaningful but make sense when it comes to disciplining officers. It also takes away the ability for departments to discriminate against police officers of color. And my organization, MAMLEO, has historically fought for the rights of police officers of color. And what we've seen is discipline matrices take away that disparate treatment for officers of color.
Vic, did you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, I have difficulty with this one because getting it right has a bigger social impact, I believe. I think that more affluent neighborhoods, if you look at our listservs, if you look at the organizations that we all belong to, and I'm sure, Jeff, you belong to the same ones I belong to, they'll highlight a department that's doing great things. A simple Google search will show you that it's in a very affluent neighborhood, predominantly white neighborhood. The citizens, rally behind their police officers. I haven't seen one yet in what we consider the inner city, communities of color. I haven't seen one that has received glowing marks. Not that it doesn't exist. I'm just saying I haven't seen it. So it's a little bit different for me to say who's doing it right, because there's so many other things that we are doing that we shouldn't be doing in law enforcement in the first place that are problematic. So I don't know. I mean, I've said that a couple of questions now, and I hate to keep saying it. But,
no, but it's very refreshing to hear people who are experts say, I don't know, because I think too often the temptation for people on panels is to spout something off. And when we don't know, we should say so, because I think that goes to something Hilary said. If we don't have data, we don't know. And there's a lot that we just don't know about how to fix policing. And this is something, part of the reason I started off with my question about what is good policing, is that often when you start talking to people, they find it very hard to define with any specificity, and even harder to think about how we would measure it. That there's a little bit of I know it when I see it, but the challenge, of course, if we can't really be specific about what that means, it's hard to train to it. It's hard to recruit for it if we have a tough time saying just what it is. And part of that answer may very well be that it would look different in different places. But we've got all kinds of fantastic questions now from the audience. So let me start throwing out some of them. Here's one that follows directly off of this conversation. Police unions, not a progressive force in policing. Many would argue a pretty reactionary force that in many places has really been very resistant to thinking about changes. Is that a fair characterization? Can the role of police unions be changed? And let me start with you on this one, Jeff.
Yeah, and I think historically that's been the case. And I think what we really have to look at is how we can make police unions understand that reform is good, that reform is needed, and that all of the practices that communities are talking about, that legislators are talking about, need to happen in order for policing to be done correctly, in order for policing to be done in a manner where the community really embraces police. We have to understand as law enforcement agencies, we have to understand as police unions that we are the community, we're part of the community, and that everything that the community wants, we should take into perspective. I do agree that most police unions are very reactionary, and they love to they love to kind of push back on everything instead of taking a step back and saying, how do we learn from this? How do we take a different perspective into the work that we're doing? And so I think police unions have to really understand that, it is about protecting rights, because we want to protect the rights of our employees, but it's also about how do we make sure that we're protecting rights, right? Making sure that we're doing our job in a manner that's effective and in a manner that the community is asking for.
Vic, what's your reaction to that one on unions?
Yeah, I agree with Jeff. I firmly believe, and I wish some legislator would say, police unions, we respect what you do, but you cannot endorse a political person, a candidate. You cannot, because it has tarnished what we're supposed to do. Now, police unions are affiliated with certain political parties. Police unions are then subject to whatever that politician or whatever that group then does. And that affects all of us. That affects the paying membership of the unions. And it's just, I think about the blue stripe, the thin blue line flag, right? When that first came out, that was pretty cool for us. It's like, okay, we get we have a thing, right? Put it on the back of your car, you do whatever, wear a t-shirt, is great. But on January 6th, you saw that same flag attacking the Capitol. So what do we do with that? What do we do when our profession then becomes affiliated with someone or something or some group that goes against what we're supposed to be doing? So unions need to stay out of politics. I'm just going to say it plainly.
Hilary, feel free to jump in on that if you want, but I have another question that I thought you might be the person to start with. When we think about policing in other countries, I'm wondering how unique the problems of policing in America are. And you're, as someone who does a lot of work on policing from a more academic perspective, is policing uniquely bad and messed up in America? And I think there's clearly a strong argument to be made that the answer to that is yes, that our particular history of racism gives it a unique twist of awfulness in this country. But at the same time, the police in Brazil and in Japan and in South Korea and in France and many parts of the world, much of our conversation, not all of it, but quite a lot of it, it seems to me, could be had about police everywhere. And do you think that that's right? And what does that tell us if it's right? Is that about something fundamental to the structure of policing, to issues of economic inequality as opposed to just race? And is it fixable?
That's a great question. At my organization, we engage pretty routinely with folks who are working on police reform and public safety redesign in other countries. The history of policing and racism in the United States is unique, but we are not the only country that has a history of colonialization or of anti-Black or anti-Indigenous racism. And other countries are grappling with that too. Police corruption is an issue in many countries, but the US model of policing is different than other places. One difference that we deal with here, in addition to our profound histories in terms of the legacy of slavery, is gun access here is so much greater than it is in many other countries. And you see many countries where police officers do not routinely carry guns because it's not perceived as necessary. You see countries where traffic enforcement is a completely separate force from criminal enforcement, where the people who are trying to make sure people aren't speeding are not interested in whether you are carrying drugs or whether you've committed a crime. There's different models that I think we can learn from in international models and research that's been done on policing on an international level that I think can be really informative to how we approach redesign in the United States. But certainly at the same time, we cannot fix public safety in the United States if we're not prepared to grapple with a uniquely American history of slavery and the legacy thereafter.
So here's another question that is coming from the audience in part. I teach at Georgetown, and most of our students come in, and if you ask them what they think about policing, they say it should be abolished. And the ones who don't say it should be abolished say it should be defunded. And there's only a very, very small percentage of students who will say, no, I think that although there are problems, the institution of the police is important and valuable, and we should fix it, not get rid of it or replace it or tear it down. And we've touched on this already. And Vic, you said there are days when you think we should just sort of tear it all down and start over. But I wonder, particularly Jeff and Vic, how do you respond? I mean, you also must encounter people, activists, younger people in particular, who feel really deeply that, that police reform is sort of rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, and you have to be prepared to say this institution is fundamentally flawed. Start all over. How do you engage with those people? How do you respond to those arguments? And I want to start with Jeff and then go to Vic on this one.
Yeah, I think that's a valid question. I think we're at an extreme crossroads in our nation where we have those conversations around abolishing the police and reforming the police and defunding the police and really trying to figure out what that looks like. I think when we look at communities across the nation, the majority of communities want to feel safe. They want to have some sense of security. And so that we know that some form of police has to exist. And so the abolishment conversation, I think, to me, is kind of insane because how can we get rid of the people that have to protect us? And there are many challenges within the system. I think we have to really figure out, how do we change the system so that the system is really representative of what the community needs? I think abolishing it means getting rid of it. The reform conversation makes more sense. It makes more sense because we are holding our elected officials accountable to reform police. We're holding our police departments accountable to reporting back to elected officials and those bureaucratic agencies that have been created, such as post, to oversee police departments. So I think what we really have to tell people is that if we do policing right, it works. I mean, in Boston, I can say policing has been done a little better than the rest of the country. I mean, we're not seeing the same incidents here that we've seen across the country that have been national news. And I think we have to figure out, how do we do better, but how do we take individual police departments and try to model them? President Obama recently, when he was in office, credited Boston for being the leader in community-based policing, right? And so other police agencies should be figuring out, how do we lead with the community engagement mindset? How do we go back to Boston and figure out what they're doing? But Boston has to be thinking, how do we do better? How do we make sure we're continuing to serve in a manner where the community respects us and the community wants us there? I think the abolition movement really is counter what the community says in terms of wanting to feel safe. But I think that there is a lot of work to do to reform agencies.
Vic, you want to chime in on this one, or?
Yeah, I was laughing initially when you said that because I'm the father of 2 activists and the uncle of about 4, so it's a tough time in my house. But I think that reform of the police is absolutely necessary. I'm a supporter of that 100%. But I also think before we talk about defunding, reimagining, was reallocating funds and all those what have become slogans now in some cases, we need to have a system behind that to support the police. There needs to be more mental health professionals out there on a 24-hour basis to respond to those calls as well. There needs to be after-school programs and job programs for folks that are out there that are struggling. A lot of the things that I saw in the 80s and 90s, the systems, and this is in Los Angeles, so, and I don't know, I've been away for a little bit, but the systems that were in place that supported the police no longer exist. It just became the police, our responsibility as cops to manage these things in real time. So the jail becomes a revolving door. Incarceration becomes a mental health facility. It's just say defund, say reimagine, say that, but then show me the system behind that. Because I'm also a consumer of law enforcement. I live in a community. I rely on the police in my community. And if you take away the police in my community, you're going to leave it up to me and my neighbor. I mean, that just like Jeff said, that's insane. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, Hilary, do you want to jump in on this?
I have to jump in on this one. I think that my organization works with abolitionists and we work with law enforcement agencies. So we learn how to speak in that across that spectrum. And I think that one of the things that I hear from abolitionists that I think that many police officers agree with is that we are asking police officers to do too much, that there are ways to further public safety that have nothing to do with enforcement. There are forms of criminalization that everyone agrees do nothing to keep people safer. And that we really can reach at least some commonality by looking to the data and by agreeing to invest in new research to look at what public health-based non-punitive systems are available that we can build up, that we can invest in, that create safer communities without policing. To give one very simple example, no one wants people to die in drug crash and DUIs and high-speed traffic crashes. Many people are killed in traffic accidents every year, and that's not acceptable, and we have to do something about that. And independent of what role enforcement plays in that, we know that there is a whole body of really robust public health literature about the role of road friction management and automobile design and road design and roundabouts. There are so many things we can do to keep people safer that have not been invested in adequately and have not been invested in equitably. So Black drivers are both far more likely to be pulled over, far more likely to be searched and to have nothing on them that would warrant that, but are also more likely to die as pedestrians in traffic accidents. So we have situations where equity in investing in social services and investing in infrastructure, in overall investing in Black and Brown communities and in other vulnerable communities can create safety in ways that don't rely on punishment and enforcement. And where we are in that spectrum, what role police play in that process is something that communities are talking about. But I think that part of moving the conversation forward is about looking to that and acknowledging that there are other ways to think about keeping communities safe. And how do we give those adequate attention and credit and investment?
And Vic, I think I was very struck by your point that there's so much less than even, in the 80s, 90s, in terms of other kinds of social services that enable police work to be more effective. And no question, across the country, cities and states have really defunded, and the federal government defunded that mental health care, for instance, educational programs, job training programs, you name it. And I actually, it seems to me that this is an area where, despite the seeming rhetorical clashes and indeed seeming deep moral clashes, that there's more agreement between police officers and police abolitionists than we often think. Or, if you go up to and I should say, I can't remember whether Andrea said this at the beginning, I spent 5 years as a reserve police officer here in Washington, D.C. You go up to a typical cop and you say, hey, we're going to defund you. You've got, your budget's too big. And that, that cop is going to say to you, are you out of your mind? Have you seen my vehicle? Have you seen my equipment? Have you seen the computers I have to work with? Did you realize that I've had my leave taken away 2 months in a row because we are so short of manpower? I'm now covering this huge area by myself. I can barely keep up with calls. I never get to take a break. You're out of your mind, drop dead, go away. On the other hand, if you ask that same officer a really different question, if you ask the same officer the question, what are the things that you do that you don't really think you should be doing? You don't really think police should be doing? And what are the things that you feel like you should do, but it's not going to be effective unless there's somebody else there? That you really get into a very different conversation. Then you get into the conversation of, oh yeah, I'm not a therapist. I'm not a social worker. I'm bad at this. I don't want to be doing that. Where are the social workers? I would love there to be these social workers who would come at 3 a.m. to mediate this domestic dispute, and I don't want to keep arresting the guy who's talking to himself and waving a knife in traffic and taking him to the emergency clinic and seeing him back out there again, same thing the next day. Where are the mental health services? And then you've got a much better kind of conversation. But actually, one of the other things that I think we've just touched on that is both a question from the audience, something that's worth drawing out some more. There's been a lot of experimentation with violence prevention efforts in this country, violence prevention efforts that are not police-based. And, my instinct is to, on the one hand, very much agree with Vic and Jeff that we may think about what we'd like public safety to look like in 30 years, 50 years, but we're here right now. We've got police. If you take them away because we have so defunded and undermined other services, you take the police away, a lot of communities are left with really nothing and will be hurt. But as we begin to experiment more and more with non-policing centered approaches to public safety, I wonder if you could talk a little bit, each of you or any of you, and I'll maybe starting with you, Jeff, about what that kind of violence prevention program looks like. Do you see them as promising? Is this a fruitful avenue for communities to be looking at?
Yeah, and I think when I mentioned earlier about President Obama calling Boston a national model, Boston police, I can say, was working really closely with social service providers, with a host of community programs to really address some of those needs, to really work towards violence prevention and providing intervention and prevention mechanisms in communities, especially around gang violence and gang awareness. And that work was working. We, as a community, reduced crime significantly, was able to build meaningful relationships with communities, with schools, with youth, with families. And it was a very productive working relationship between the police and the communities. Unfortunately, what we've seen, over the last 2 years, rightfully so, there's been a lot of controversy between the police, and a lot of those organizations have pushed back away from police or have decided they don't want to work in collaboration with the police. But those organizations were working really closely with the police to kind of divert some of that work to those organizations. When we were getting those calls for people who needed that intervention, needed that prevention mechanism to help them do better in communities. When people had mental health issues, there were various providers that could step in to intervene. A lot of that was shifted away because of the recent reckoning and racial issues within police departments across the country. But I could say that our co-response model has worked, right? And understanding that co-response model could turn into maybe a mental health clinician responding on their own to mental health issues versus the police responding. But we have to understand or think about what the safety element is there, right? If someone is in distress, someone may be violent, if the police step back and decide we're not going to step in and intervene, are we putting a social worker in a pretty bad place? Are we putting someone in in a position where they're going to get hurt. And we still haven't answered those questions. And we really have to come together as a community to answer those questions and figure out, are we making sure that we're protecting those people that are going in to deliver those services as well?
Did anybody else want to chime in on that? I know we're getting towards the end of the program and have a few other questions. So, all right, let me move on so we can get as much in as we possibly can before we close. One of the questions that's come up both in our conversation and in the Q&A from the audience relates to recruiting. And I wondered if you could comment on what needs to change about how police departments recruit, and to what end. And one of the things that I often ask my own students to look for examples of positive police recruiting videos on YouTube and negative ones. And the negative ones they come up with are usually police departments where the recruiting video consists of a bunch of men in essentially military gear jumping out of helicopters and tackling fleeing suspects and breaking down doors. And that's going to attract people who want to break down doors and tackle fleeing suspects. But what's the right kind of recruit to attract, and can we do it? How do we do it? And I wonder also if you can talk a little bit about gender. I mean, women, it's one of the most male dominated occupations in the country. Women make up less than 13% of all sworn law enforcement officers nationwide. Does that matter? Does that show in policing? Let me start with you, Vic, on this one.
Yeah, I think you're right about those videos too. That got me into law enforcement when I saw one, let me tell you, but that was 1982. So, but yeah, now you get those types of videos right now. That is the worst message to put out there. But I want to go one step beyond the recruitment piece, right? Because I'm not a person that does recruitment videos or even study that, but it's the background piece, right? You can recruit all the folks you want, but once they get through the testing phase and they go into the backgrounds, who's doing the background checks? Who is actually looking to see someone who grew up in what we in LA call the hood? You're going to have a different lived experience than you do if you're in the suburbs or in a more affluent neighborhood. Is that really a disqualifier at this stage today? If you smoked weed when you were 16, are you not eligible to be a cop when you're 23? And if you graduated from college and you went to a party school, but you have a degree, are you a more likely candidate to be a police officer knowing what goes on in school? Yeah. Let's be very honest. So the background piece and that selection model right there, that filters out a lot of good candidates. And we hear it all the time. I've wanted to be a cop my whole life, but I couldn't because I smoked a joint when I was 17.
Yep.
That makes zero sense to me. I also think that the recruitment piece should be based on a compassion model and an emotional intelligence model versus toughness. You have to be tough. Okay, of course you have to be tough to be in this job. Mentally tough, physically in shape, but mentally tough. And I think we lost traction there. I think we've made just toughness in the general sense the key.
Well, I hate to say this because I feel like this discussion could keep going for another hour. We wouldn't run out of things to talk about, but we're just about out of time. So we're going to have to stop. Thank you all for this incredibly rich and thought-provoking conversation. I know we're just beginning to scratch the surface of all of these issues. So let me just say this is going to conclude our program. I thank you to all of you for this wonderful conversation. Thank you to the audience for your terrific and numerous questions. This program has been recorded. It will be posted on the Radcliffe website at radcliffe.harvard.edu. You can also visit that same website if you want to get additional information about any of the panelists today and our backgrounds, and get in contact with people. And you can also see on that same website the schedule for future Radcliffe programs and videos of past events. I think that wraps things up, and thank you, everybody.